Septimus. There was once upon a time a king and queen who ruled a very wealthy kingdom. The great king was named Petard. He was a good man, rather blunt, and of strong mind. He really was the best king in the world, but his subjects were nearly as much masters of the kingdom as he himself, for on the most trivial occasions they offered their advice loudly without being asked, and each hoped that their notions on governance would be noticed and followed. The queen, called Gilletta, was as good and great as her husband, and her character was mild, sweet, and inoffensive. She spoke with wisdom and often in thought-out and careful sentences. As Petard was the only child of the king and queen, they resolved from his birth to marry him to a neighboring princess, whose guardian was a fairy named Gangan. It is true that the princess had not yet been born, but upon Gangan's assurance that she would one day be accomplished, all that she required was promised, and an oath was even taken to ensure it. When Petard reached 25, he thought it proper to marry for love, troubling himself little with his parents' promises. He married, without their consent, an extremely pretty young lady of whom he was very fond. She was only the daughter of a rich farmer, yet although she had married a king's son, her natural good sense prevented her from becoming vain and silly. Petard's father, the king, angry at his son's defiance, could not refuse the fairy Gangan the right to avenge the affront he had suffered. Accordingly, he disinherited Petard, forbade him ever to appear at court, and granted him a portion of land, a considerable estate on which his father-in-law, Carbuncle, had been the farmer. All the favor Petard received was to leave to raise this estate into a sovereignty, giving himself the title of king and majesty. Shortly after his disgrace, Petard's father died. His mother, having obtained the regency, was not sorry to be unburdened by a son who might have thwarted her projects and opposed her desire to reign. Petard soon grew accustomed to his estate and became very content with it. With his wisdom, he grew his kingdom to a mighty state, and he reigned therein as though, in fact, it was quite as large as he needed. The titles of king and majesty were sufficient for him, but as even the wisest of minds have their share of vanity, he soon took pride in imitating his father, creating a governor, a solicitor general, and a chamberlain. In those days, kings administered justice themselves and received their revenues personally. He also coined money and, together with his governor, established regulations for the police of his vast kingdom. His father-in-law, Carbuncle, was honored with the title of governor. He was a frank, sincere, and upright man, endowed with good common sense and a spark of imagination. He decided slowly but almost always justly. He knew by heart the verses of the poets of his time and was fond of reciting them. This appointment did not make him vain. He continued to manage the farm as diligently as before, earning his son-in-law's confidence so fully that the king soon found he could do nothing without him. Carbuncle visited the king every morning and took breakfast with him. They discussed matters of state, though the minister would very often say, "Sire, with your permission, you do not understand it. Allow me to manage, and all will go well. Let every man mind his own affairs, as the poet says." "But," replied the king, "what shall I do then?" "Whatever you like," answered Carbuncle. "You can govern your wife and your kitchen garden. That is all that is required of you." "In truth, I think you are right," said the king. "So do as you think fit." This was not very wise of the king. Yet, to lose nothing in the way of reputation, he always displayed himself on feast days in a royal cloak of red cloth, embroidered with golden flowers, and a cap of the same material, bearing a golden scepter. Following his governor's advice, he obtained almanacs, annual calendars containing important astronomical data, forwarded each year in July, which he bound in fine marbled paper with golden edges. In one he learned the proper times for sowing, planting, cutting, grafting, draining, and clearing. He trusted it so implicitly. He also studied political prophecies, which fascinated him so entirely. Over the years, these almanacs formed an impressive library, which he cherished and to which only he and Carbuncle held the keys. In the afternoons, he employed himself in his royal kitchen garden, putting into practice the lessons of the almanac. In the evening, supper was taken publicly with the Queen, and by 10 o'clock everyone was in bed. Queen Gilletta, for her part, busied herself with household affairs. She spun with her women and made excellent cheeses from the milk of cows and goats. But above all, every morning she never failed to knead a cake of barley flour, which she carried along with a cream cheese to her exquisite garden, placing it at the foot of a rose tree, as had been directed to her in a dream the day after her wedding. The tranquility they enjoyed in their peaceful kingdom was only disturbed by one longing, the desire for children. 2 years had passed since their marriage, and King Petard had begun to despair when one day, while he was in the fruit garden with his governor, the kingdom's midwife, who was also the Queen's first lady of honor, came to him with joyful news. He was likely to become a father. Transported with delight, he embraced the midwife with all his heart, and taking from his finger a fine cat's eye ring, presented it to her. He did not stop there. That evening he held a grand supper for all the chief men of his kingdom, after which he fired off artillery, consisting of 12 arquebuses with locks and 6 carbines with rods. It is said that in his joy he uttered words incompatible with his dignity. When his governor objected, he replied by throwing a large glass of wine in Carbuncle's face and said, "Many thanks, father-in-law. You are perhaps right, but one is not a father every day. Let us say no more about it and rejoice, for in my place you would perhaps act quite as wisely." Carbuncle made no reply, and all withdrew from the presence of their majesties well pleased. As the king was beloved by his subjects, rejoicings were made the same day and hour throughout the kingdom to celebrate this happy event. "Everything comes in time to him who can wait," said the Queen quietly. And so it was, instead of one child, she gave King Petard 7 children at a single birth, 3 boys, 3 girls, and then another boy. All the children were very beautiful, with the most beautiful eyes ever seen, flawless skin, and eyebrows as black as jet, matching their curly hair. But the king and queen favored the last-born son above all the others, and the queen herself insisted on nursing the little Septimus, as he was named. By the time the 3 princes reached 18 months, they were so lively and playful that the nurses could scarcely manage them. When they complained to the king, he replied, "Let them alone. When they are as old as I am, they will not be so lively. I was the same, I who speak to you, all in good time." The 3 princesses, in contrast, were gentle souls who loved the solitude of the palace. This caused the king to prefer his sons, and the queen to favor her daughters, except for Septimus, who was different than his brothers or sisters. He would soon have been spoiled, had not a kind fairy of the fields, unknown to fairy Gangan, and even to Queen Gilletta, endowed him with a stable and unchangeable character. When the time came to wean the children, a cabinet council was summoned. The governor, the solicitor general, the chamberlain, and the nurses were all present. After lengthy discussion, Carbuncle advised the use of cow's milk for the 3 boys and goat's milk for the 3 girls. This was considered a simple and effective means of moderating the vivacity of the princes and the gentleness of the princesses. Yet when the children grew older and required more substantial nourishment, they consumed such enormous quantities that it was becoming a challenge to keep up with them. The princes had lost only part of their vivacity, while the princesses had gained additional energy and spirit. This led to uproarious quarreling and endless skirmishes throughout the day. They fought and pulled each other about, wearing out so many royal clothes that there could scarcely be enough for them. The little Septimus alone remained mild and obedient, though his brothers and sisters constantly played mischievous tricks upon him. The king would often remark to the queen, "Your 3 daughters grow excessively tall, and by my scepter I hardly know what I shall do with them. As for my sons, I will give them the care of my land, but your daughters, well, that is another matter." To which the queen replied patiently, "Sire, let us have patience, for everything comes in time to him who can wait." While King Petard fretted and Queen Gilletta remained calm, the children reached the age of 7. Every member of the court had already offered advice, or rather decreed decisions, concerning the establishment of the princes and princesses. One morning, as the queen had just kneaded her cake, she perceived on the table a pretty little blue mouse nibbling at the dough. Her first impulse was to drive it away, but an involuntary feeling stayed her hand. She watched attentively and was much surprised to see the mouse seize the cake and carry it up the chimney. Her calmness gave way to curiosity, and running after the mouse with the intent of reclaiming her treasure, she witnessed both disappear, and in their place stood a little shriveled old woman, scarcely a foot high. The tiny old woman made several grimaces and uttered half-intelligible words. She placed the shovel and tongs across each other, traced 3 circles and 3 triangles over them with her broom, uttered 7 short, sharp cries, and concluded by tossing the broom over her head. The queen, despite her fear, noted that the old woman had distinctly pronounced 3 words while tracing the symbols: confidence, discretion, happiness. She was attempting to discern their meaning when a voice from the next room drew her attention. Thinking it was Septimus, she ran to him, but upon opening the door, she perceived a marvelous sight. 3 large mayflies, each holding one of her daughters in its tiny paws, and 3 tall young ladies carrying her 3 sons upon their backs. All 6 flew through the window in unison, singing melodiously, "Fly away, fly of May, fly away, fly away. We are snatched from the fleeting world of vanity and pride." Their capture represents their detachment from earthly folly, which will later force them into transformation and growth. What moved Queen Gilletta most was to see in the midst of them Septimus between the paws of the blue mouse. They were both seated in a tiny car made from a large rose-colored snail shell, drawn by 2 goldfinches with beautifully streaked feathers. The mouse, larger than ordinary, was dressed in a splendid gown of Persian silk, with a mantle of black velvet, a hood tied under its chin, and 2 little blue horns upon its forehead. The car, the mayflies, and the young ladies vanished so quickly that the queen soon lost sight of them. More concerned at the loss of Septimus and her children than at the fairies and their powers, she began to call out and weep with all her might. The king, hearing her grief, ran to her chamber, followed by his governor, anxious to know what had occurred. But Queen Gilletta's sorrow was so overwhelming that she could only utter, "The giant mayflies, the young ladies, ah, sire, my children are torn from me." The king, hearing only the last words, abruptly left her side and ordered Carbuncle to fetch 2 muskets from the antechamber. He always kept a half-dozen at hand. Crossing his royal kitchen garden, he set out into the countryside with the intent of pursuing and slaying the robbers. About an hour after he departed, the queen, having exhausted her tears and sighing for the loss of her children, perceived a humming sound around her. At her feet fell a small square piece of paper. She picked it up, opened it hastily, and read, "Calm your uneasiness, my dear Queen Gilletta, and remember that your happiness depends on confidence and discretion. You have begun well by your exactness in giving me your cakes and cheeses, and my gratitude will do the rest, but always be convinced that everything comes in time to him who can wait, and that you may hope for everything. From your friend, the Fairy of the Fields." This note, together with her confidence in the fairy's power, was enough to calm her. she addressed the little linnet bird perched at the top of her bed. "Linnet, pretty linnet," said she, "I will do all that you wish, but tell me, I beg, as soon as you hear of him, some news of my little Prince Septimus." At these words, the linnet bird fluttered its wings, sang a few notes, and flew away. The queen, persuaded that this was equivalent to a consent, thanked it and made the bird a low curtsy. Meanwhile, the king and his governor, tired of their fruitless pursuit, returned home. Finding the queen so calm, the king was somewhat offended at her apparent indifference. He questioned her to ascertain the cause, to which Gilletta replied only, "Everything comes in time to him who can wait." This coolness vexed him so that he might have flown into a passion, had not Carbuncle reminded him that the queen was right. The king, who held Carbuncle as an oracle, was silent and listened attentively to the governor's gentle sermon on the vexations and expenses which children almost always entail for their parents. "By my scepter," said the king, "my father-in-law is right. Those 7 children would have ruined me had they remained with me much longer. Therefore, many thanks to him or her who has taken them as they came, so are they gone. It is only lost time. Let us rejoice and begin again." The queen, prudent and cautious, said nothing, and the king, having no further comment, returned to his closet to play card games with his governor. While all this was passing with King Petard, the queen, tiring of her king's attitude, which had lasted unusually long, resolved to remarry. After the mayflies carried away the royal children, King Petard temporarily left the palace. He retreated to the countryside, relieved to be rid of the noise and responsibility that came with both his children and royal life. He preferred his governor, his card games, his kitchen garden, and a quiet, simple existence. King Petard was content to let the world move on without him for some time. His wife, Queen Gilletta, on the other hand, grew tired of solitude and of his indifference, and decided to remarry. So she set her eyes upon a young prince of a neighboring kingdom, sovereign of the Green Islands. He was handsome and well-made, and his mind was as pleasing as his person. His pleasures were his only employments, and nothing was heard of but his gallantries. It was said that every pretty woman in his kingdom was deeply in love with him. The queen's infatuation grew with the aid of a portrait of the prince, as she flattered herself that she could captivate him and fix his inconstancy. There was only one difficulty. She was no longer a young queen, but she was altogether lovely. And she was still a figure that commanded respect and inspired love. She reflected that it might be difficult to please the young king of the Green Islands unless she could obtain her youth again. But how to go about it? It was true that Gangan, the fairy, might assist her, but the queen had repeatedly resisted Gangan's advice to adopt her niece and proclaim her heiress to the crown. She feared provoking the fairy's wrath by requesting help for herself. The queen hesitated and struggled, yet she could not tear her eyes from the prince's portrait. Love at last conquered her fear, and she confided her desires to Gangan, conjuring her in the most pressing terms to aid her with her art and not refuse this essential request. She even showed the fairy the prince's portrait, seeking her approval. Gangan, though surprised, concealed her resentment. She foresaw that openly protesting would be unwise, since the prince, nearly ruined by his own extravagance, might find it convenient to agree to the union for his own interests, and a powerful protecting genius of his kingdom could foil any designs. So, pretending to consent to the affair, she promised to make the queen young again, but secretly resolved to deceive her and place the execution of her will beyond the queen's power. On the day appointed by the fairy Gangan for the fulfillment of her promises, she appeared dressed in a long black and silver satin robe. Her headdress was composed entirely of flowers and shiny trinkets. A little dwarf held the end of her robe and carried under his left arm a black china box. The queen received her with the greatest marks of respect and gratitude, and after the usual compliments, begged her not to delay her happiness. The fairy Gangan consented, caused everyone else to retire, and commanded her dwarf to shut the doors and windows. Then, taking from her box a vellum book ornamented with large silver clasps, a wand made of 3 metals, and a vial containing a clear greenish liquid, she seated the queen on a cushion in the center of the room and placed the dwarf opposite her. Tracing 3 spiral circles around them, she read from her book, touched both the queen and the dwarf 3 times with her wand, and sprinkled them with the magical liquid. Gradually, the queen's size became smaller, while the dwarf's size increased in proportion, until in less than 3 minutes they had completely exchanged their figures without feeling any discomfort. Although the queen faced the transformation with courage, she could not witness the dwarf's growth without some fear, especially when a bluish flame suddenly rose from the 3 circles, causing her to faint. The fairy Gangan, having completed the enchantment, opened a window and vanished with her page, who, despite his new size, still carried the queen's robe and the china box. Upon regaining her senses, the queen first consulted her looking-glass. To her delight, her features were exquisite, but she did not notice that they were those of a little girl of 8 or 9. Her royal robes and crown had become a child's dress and cap, complete with a lace apron. Her slender figure, unchanged by the spell, rendered her a most funny object. But she observed none of this, for her thoughts were entirely absorbed by the Prince of the Green Islands and her love for him. Thus contented, she bewildered her courtiers, who knew neither how to act nor what to say. The Prime Minister, upon whom all depended, freed them from their embarrassment, decreeing that it was necessary to flatter Her Majesty's tastes and humors. He began by ordering his wife and daughters to conform to her will. Soon, the rest of the court followed suit. In short order, all dressed like the queen and imitated her every action. Even the men began to speak childishly. Games were limited to childish ones. The cooks prepared nothing but custards, tartlets, and little cream puffs. At all games and feasts, conversation centered exclusively on the king of the Green Islands. The queen spoke of him 100 times a day, always calling him her husband. She demanded news of him continually and was temporarily satisfied with any trickery designed to flatter or deceive her, but her gaiety soon gave way to caprice, and she displayed all the whims of a child who has not obtained her desire, while her attendants dared not oppose her. For a time the court amused itself with this singular event, for at times royal courts take pleasure in novelty. But eventually they grew weary of the childlike queen, and the constant need to humor her, they abandoned her royal court entirely. It seemed as though she would be left alone, until the court circular announced that the young king of the Green Islands, traveling through neighboring kingdoms, would soon arrive. At this news, spirits revived. The queen became so cheerful that she sang and danced incessantly while awaiting the prince. The happy moment arrived, she ran to meet him. Although informed that it violated etiquette, she resolved to receive him at the foot of her staircase. Hastily descending, she became entangled in her recently lengthened train and fell violently. Though her hand saved her head and her nose was only slightly grazed, she was so frightened that she cried out and was carried to her chamber. The purest water bathed her face, and she was only calmed upon being told that her prince husband had arrived. Indeed, the prince appeared, but the sight of her ridiculous figure made him laugh so violently that he fled the room, and even the palace. The queen, witnessing his departure, cried out that she wanted her prince husband. He was entreated to return, but in vain. He could not consent, and made the best of his way from a royal court that seemed to him mad and insane. The queen, inconsolable, could not be soothed. Her ill humor grew unbearable even to those who had loved her. Many, ashamed to be her subjects, thought it best to dethrone her, an act nearly carried out when Gangan, wishing only to disgust the queen with marriage, disenchanted her and restored her original appearance. At sight of her true figure, the queen felt despair. She had found herself charming in her enchanted form, and now faced an aged face and aged body which she detested. She never imagined she had appeared ridiculous in her youthful guise, and her love for the prince remained undiminished. The loss of her youth and of the Prince of the Green Islands threw her into a stupor and tiredness that threatened her life and inspired an implacable hatred for the fairy Gangan. Meanwhile, the subjects began to pity her and regarded these events as just punishment for her ambition and insensate desires, which had sacrificed maternal tenderness and gratitude. It was at this time that the Fairy of the Fields had taken away the children of King Petard and Queen Gilletta. This generous fairy, protector of those who lived in the country, worked incessantly to prevent or diminish their misfortunes. She was able to do so more effectively as she enjoyed the friendship and favor of Titania, Queen of the Fairies. The Isle of Bambine, placed under the Fairy of the Fields government, was the destination to which she had transported the 4 boys and 3 girls of King Petard and Queen Gilletta. This isle was inhabited solely by children who, under the protection of the fairies, were carefully tended by nurses and attendants. A perpetual spring reigned there. The trees and meadows were always laden with fruits and flowers, and the earth spontaneously produced all that could please the eye or delight the palate. The walks were enchanting, and the gardens filled with pretty horse-drawn carriages of every kind. But the most remarkable feature was that the walls of the children's rooms were made of sugar candy, the floors of preserved citron, and the furniture of exquisite gingerbread. When they behaved well, the children could eat these delicacies to their heart's content without diminishing or injuring them in the slightest. In the streets and walks, dolls of every size and shape moved, danced, and played by themselves. The little girls, if neither proud, greedy, nor disobedient, had only to make a wish, and sweetmeats and fruits would come to them, while the dolls threw themselves into their arms, permitting themselves to be dressed, caressed, or even scolded with unparalleled docility. But when these same girls committed any fault, the dolls fled, making faces, and the sweetmeats turned bitter, while the dolls' dresses became dirty and shabby. The little boys, when obedient and industrious, found clowns, puppets, kites, and every imaginable plaything at their disposal. But when they were obstinate, lazy, or mischievous, the clowns and puppets mocked them, bouncing against their noses and reminding them of their faults, and the kites refused to fly. In short, nothing succeeded for the disobedient, and the more obstinate they were, the worse it became. There were rewards and punishments for every age. One might find a donkey instead of a carefully jeweled saddled horse, or hear cruel remarks about her appearance, while the well-behaved children were praised, caressed, and rewarded. Nothing was neglected to correct both the heart and the mind. The children were even allowed to read the records and books of fairyism, containing remarkable tales from across the world: Bluebeard, Prince Luton, the Beneficent Frog, the Good Little Mouse, the Blue Bird, and many others. The Fairy of the Fields had carefully collected these stories, which formed the source for much of the fairy library. During the children's residence on the Isle of Bambine, every means was employed to curb the stubbornness of the 3 boys and the pride of the 3 girls. Yet, far from improving, their faults only strengthened with age. For 4 years the fairy governess herself, joined by the patience and care of the nurses, struggled in vain to moderate their dispositions. Seeing that ordinary education could not succeed, the fairy queen resorted to the extreme measure of metamorphosis. Though harsh, it was necessary to shape their future characters. Thus, the 3 sons of King Petard were transformed into puppets, and the 3 daughters were transformed into dancing dolls, condemned to remain puppets and dancing dolls for 3 years. The children, despite their transformations, retained their original thoughts and sentiments, while adapting to the laws of their new forms. Once the fairy of the fields, who could penetrate their thoughts, judged them reformed, she restored them to their natural shapes and rewarded them with advantageous placements. Prince Septimus, however, had pleased the fairy of the fields, and she resolved to protect him from witnessing the punishment of his siblings. The only difficulty was finding a safe asylum where he could be shielded from Gangan's machinations and wicked schemes. To ensure nothing was overlooked, the fairy of the fields decided to consult her friend, the queen of the fairies, for advice. She donned her green velvet gown, a yellow-colored satin mantle, and her little blue riding hood, with 9 mayflies harnessed to her golden horse-drawn carriage with rose-colored ribbons. She set out diligently and soon arrived at the fortunate island where the queen of the fairies ordinarily resided. Having alighted at the end of a magnificent avenue of orange and citron trees, the fairy of the fields entered the courtyard of the castle. There, in perfect formation, she found 24 genii, each 6 feet high, wearing long gowns with trains and carrying polished steel clubs upon their left shoulders. Behind them were 74 ostriches, spotted with red and blue, held in leashes, all maintaining a profound silence. Upon seeing the fairy, they saluted her by grounding their clubs on the steel pavement, producing sparks of fire with a sharp clang. Such honors were customary for those who, like the fairy of the fields, governed others, ascending a staircase of porphyry, jasper, agate, and lapis lazuli. She entered the first apartment, where 12 young ladies were simply dressed, with no hoods, and each wore only a keychain and half wand, which they used to salute her, just as the genii had. The fairy returned their salutation. These young ladies were being initiated in the arts of fairyism. Passing through a long suite of magnificently furnished apartments, she finally reached the queen's antechamber, filled with fairies from all corners of the world, some on business, others paying court to her majesty. The fairy queen's chambers were nearly empty when Gangan, the wicked fairy, emerged. Though fairies and all virtuous beings pay respect to sovereigns, even the fairy of the fields could scarcely suppress a laugh at the grotesque figure of Gangan. Over a green satin skirt embroidered with blue and gold lace, Gangan wore a large robe adorned with rose-colored caterpillars and trinkets, a half-girdle set with emeralds, a small mirror and patch box hanging from a silver chain, a large watch, and a casket of rare coins. Her ears were weighed down with pearl and ruby drops, and a pale yellow velvet hood, adorned with amethysts and topazes, crowned her head. A bouquet of jasmine decorated her chest, and 10 or 12 patches scattered over her faded makeup concealed a pale-colored skin. The fairy of the fields was surprised at this ridiculous display, and Gangan in turn was equally taken aback by the sudden appearance of her rival. She knew of the protection the fairy extended to the children of Petard and Gilletta, but constrained by her location, she could not express her resentment. Affecting an air of politeness mingled with dignity, Gangan said, "What, madam, have you resolved to leave the quiet of the country to revel in the tumult of a court? You must have weighty reasons for such a sacrifice. The reasons which bring you and me here are certainly widely different," interrupted the fairy of the fields. "Neither interest nor ambition have ever been motives for my protection. I grant it only to the worthy and grateful." "I believe so," replied Gangan. "Turkeys and geese are a very good sort of people." "True," answered the fairy of the fields warmly, "much more so than Gangan's, for they are not unjust. What say you to that?" Their dispute might have continued indefinitely, had the fairy of the fields not been warned that the fairy queen awaited her. The two fairies saluted and parted, as women who despise each other always do. Titania, perceiving the emotion raised by this encounter in her friend, feigned ignorance but requested to be informed. The fairy of the fields pleased to satisfy her sovereign's curiosity, revealed Gangan's unjust persecution of King Petard and Queen Gilletta and explained how she had intervened to thwart it. "Your intentions are praiseworthy," said Titania. "I am glad to see such generous zeal in protecting the unfortunate, yet I fear Gangan may still seek revenge for your kindness to Gilletta and her children. She is wicked, and though I often receive complaints concerning her, be assured that if she abuses her power again, I will punish her severely. I cannot say more. The council hour has arrived, but upon my return we shall confer on ways to thwart her wicked designs." With this, Titania left the apartment. Alone, the Fairy of the Fields could not resist consulting the sovereign's books, which contained all the mysteries of fairyism, and allowed the reader to see what was happening throughout the universe. Only the Queen could suspend or alter the course of events, holding over fairies the same dominion that they held over mankind. No sooner had she opened these books than the fairy discovered that, by the power of grand fairyism, the perfidious and treacherous fairy Gangan was carrying off young Prince Septimus to the inaccessible island. Trembling first for the prince's safety and then for the state of his heart and mind, she reflected on how best to prevent the consequences of this dire event. When the Queen returned from council, Titania, noticing the sorrow on her friend's face, guessed what had occurred. She said gently, "You have, I see, satisfied your curiosity and learned that which I would have kept from you. I could not refuse Gangan the power of grand fairyism, for it is hers by law, yet I have limited it to a fixed time. Be assured, generous friend, that if she abuses this power, she shall be severely punished. Meanwhile, to safeguard the other children of Gilletta, take this vial and rub them with its contents. It is invisible water, invisible to fairies alone. It will protect them from Gangan's reach. Always remember that your fairy queen loves generosity, protects virtue, and that you may rely upon her protection and tenderness." At these words, the Fairy of the Fields respectfully took the Fairy Queen's hand, kissed it, and departed. No sooner had the Fairy of the Fields returned to her island than she put the invisible water to use. With it, she rubbed the 3 puppets and the 3 dancing dolls, leaving only the tips of their noses visible so she could recognize them herself. Having given her orders and consulted her books, she set out for Petard's kingdom, where her presence was urgently required. Indeed, upon her arrival, the kingdom of King Petard was in utter disorder. The cause was this: it had been long since the house in which His Majesty resided, and in which his father-in-law, the governor, had lived before him, had begun to crumble on all sides despite repeated repairs. Petard, in consultation with his chief architect, a master mason, resolved to rebuild it. The mason, having done little for the royal household in recent years, had completely demolished the old structure with plans for a new one far more magnificent. Petard's annual revenues since the abduction of his children were insufficient for such an undertaking. Acting on the advice of his Chamberlain and Solicitor General, he determined to levy a tax to fund the new palace. His subjects, unaccustomed to taxation, murmured loudly and swore they would not comply. They even threatened to appeal to the Queen Mother. Added to this discontent were the objections of Carbuncle, who argued passionately that it was ridiculous to make others pay for something neither useful nor profitable to them, insisting that the king, like any man, should live within his means. 1 crown should be spent for 1 crown earned. The arguments of the Chamberlain and Solicitor General, however, were no less forceful. They declared that subjects existed to support their ruler, who had the right to spend for the kingdom's benefit. Each counselor loudly proclaimed his own opinion. "They shall not pay," cried one faction. "They shall be made to pay," countered the other. "It shall not be so," said Carbuncle. "I am determined." "It shall," said the Solicitor General, "or I will lose my tongue." The uproar became such that it was impossible to hear oneself think. King Petard, bewildered and unsure whom to follow, left the council and went to the queen. "Oh, by my scepter," he exclaimed, "if this continues, I will give up governing. Whoever wishes to be king may take the crown. I will go so far as to refuse hearing a word about the kingdom, the people, or the palace." "Do not irritate yourself, sire," said the queen quietly. "I have already told your majesty that everything comes in time to those who can wait." "Odds fish," said the king. "What should I wait for? If those who took our children had left us a new palace instead, we would not be so bad off. But doubtless the fairy Gangan has done it all. At this rate we shall have no more homes than we have children." He went on to repeat a long string of tiresome verbal abuse and cursing against the fairies, vexing the good Queen Gilletta greatly. The fairy of the fields, having observed the proceedings and anxious for the queen's peace of mind, at last appeared to her in the shape of a linnet bird, as she had done before, and soothed her with the assurance that she would soon provide convincing proofs of her friendship and protection. Queen Gilletta, overjoyed, kissed the fairy 1,000 times, first asking permission, then promising that as a token of gratitude she would allow herself a cake of millet flour, hemp seed, and milk every day while residing with her. The fairy of the fields agreed, and Gilletta's promise was faithfully fulfilled. A fortnight later, King Petard, accustomed to rising early, was astonished to find himself in an entirely new palace, convenient and well built. There was grand architecture, paintings, sculptures, and gold. The ground floor contained a kitchen, pantry, dining room, and audience chamber. The first floor held an antechamber, a bedroom, a closet, the queen's wardrobe, and a large closet in a wing for the king, which housed his library. Above were well-ceiled galleries with the most beautiful prospect imaginable. A fully equipped dairy had not been forgotten. Most remarkable of all, the royal palace was furnished in the exact style and materials as the previous palace, so perfectly that distinguishing the old from the new was difficult, save for the obvious freshness of the new furniture. Petard's astonishment was immense. Yet it grew further when he looked from a bedroom window to see his royal kitchen garden, a large grass plot, and a bowling green, at the end of which lay a pretty pond and a forest of lofty trees. To the right of the green was the kitchen garden, and to the left an orchard planted with every kind of fruit tree. After a long, amazed contemplation, joy took over. He ran to the queen, who was still asleep, and waking her, exclaimed, my dear, get up and look at our new palace and gardens. Do you know what this means?" "I have not the least idea," murmured the queen, scarcely allowing herself time to dress before rushing to the window. King Petard led her through all the apartments down to the ground floor and finally through the gardens. Every marvel, from the perfectly arranged rooms to the well-stocked kitchen, filled them with wonder. The queen, who understood the source of these miracles, felt no fear, though she dared not speak. Their inspection was interrupted only when the governor, having searched the king's house for an hour, arrived. More from duty than expectation, he entered equally amazed by the overnight transformation. Together, with each taking an arm of the queen, they toured the house and gardens again, this time from top to bottom. Everyone debated at great length the singularity of this occurrence. Some maintained that their majesties were bold indeed to reside in a palace built by fairies, thus risking annoyance or even torment from those magical beings. Others argued quite the opposite, that they had done wisely, and that it would be well if all the old houses in the kingdom were rebuilt in a similar miraculous manner. As is often the case with comforts and novelties, after much discussion, the matter was soon forgotten. The king grew gradually accustomed to his new palace, as though he had lived there all his life. The question of the tax faded from memory, peace returned to the kingdom of Petard, and harmony was restored among the high-crowned officers. Only the poor architect remained half in despair, contemplating hanging himself, but eventually settled for cursing every genie and fairy at the bottom of the sea, calling them magicians and sorcerers 100 times over for interfering with his work. While the fairy of the fields orchestrated all these wonders, she observed in Queen Gilletta a deep respect for fairies and heartfelt gratitude toward herself. So moved was she by the queen's good heart that she resolved to prolong her stay at the court beyond her original plan. She reassured Gilletta regarding her children, explaining their punishment and the reasons for such extreme measures. Yet, as true and tender friendship knows how to disguise painful truths when revealing them would cause distress, she carefully concealed from the queen the abduction of young Septimus, as well as the anxiety she herself felt for him. She advised the queen to maintain confidence, patience, and discretion if she wished to attain happiness, then with regret return to her governance of the Isle of Bambine. Upon her arrival, she was immediately informed of a most extraordinary event, unprecedented since the founding of the island. The senior nurse, who had acted as governess during the fairy's absence, reported that some obstinate and unruly children, despite being forgiven on multiple occasions, had, with the aid of their doll companions, revolted and refused to obey their nurses. The rebellion had grown so rapidly that it was only with great difficulty that it was partially suppressed. The nurse had been forced to exercise her authority. The dolls were imprisoned in boxes. Some children were condemned to eat only dry bread for a fortnight. Others were made to wear nightcaps during the day for a month. And some were even confined between 4 chairs for 2 hours each day until they publicly asked pardon. The fairy heartily approved of the senior nurse's diligence and praised her zeal. Yet, deeming an exemplary punishment necessary for maintaining order, she transformed the most mutinous rebels into punches, judies, and dancing dolls for a term of 100 years, sending them to various corners of the world to earn their living as puppets, amusing well-behaved children and entertaining the public. She felt little regret, for her 6 favorites had played only a minor role in the uprising. Delighted by the improvement she observed in these children, the fairy summoned them and, speaking gently to the tips of their visible noses, reproved them mildly. She dismissed them with promises of friendship and rewards should they conduct themselves properly in the future. Although her duties required her presence on the Isle of Bambine, the fairy's thoughts continually turned to little Septimus. Her impatience to learn of his condition soon outweighed all else. When she judged that her charges could manage tolerably well without her, she departed once more, determined to satisfy both her curiosity and her affection for the young prince. To avoid being perceived by the genii and fairies who constantly traversed the middle region of the air, she entered her golden carriage, carefully closed on all sides, and armed with her wand, other articles of fairyism, and, above all, the invisible water. Commanding her 6 flying lizards to swift flight, she reached within minutes a point near the inaccessible island. She alighted, dismissed her chaise, and, anointing herself with the invisible water, overcame the numerous obstacles that otherwise would have barred her entry. Gangan, anticipating intrusion by fairies or genii, had encircled her island with a triple defense. A furious torrent whose waters surged over jagged rocks, tearing up tree trunks and hurling fragments into the waves. The shores patrolled by 24 enormous dragons whose flames, when sighting any fairy or genie, shot to the clouds, merging into an impenetrable wall of fire. The fairy of the fields had scarcely been seeking intelligence of Septimus's fate for an hour when chance presented her with the most favorable opportunity in the world. She saw Gangan approaching, accompanied by a dive, her face inflamed with passion and her words sharp and vehement. Seizing the advantage of her invisibility, the fairy of the fields resolved to listen. She overheard Gangan speak to her companion almost as follows: Yes, my dear Barbarek, you see me in despair. I am about to lose forever the largest kingdom of the universe. The ungrateful mother of Petard has died without so much as a desire to reconcile with me. And that is not all. She has bound her subjects by oath, not only never to receive from me a successor to a crown, but even to restore the throne to her son or any of her grandsons. I tried to win the people with kindness, but found everywhere an inveterate hatred against me. They refused my gifts, viewing them as perfidious and treasonable, and have formally resolved to follow the late Queen's direction, depriving me of the throne where I had hoped to place my charge. It shall not, however, be long before this ungrateful people feel the full measure of my just anger. To begin with the chief causes of my disgrace, take from my stables one of my largest griffins, fly to the Isle of Bambine, seize the brothers and sisters of Septimus, and bring them here. I myself will carry off Petard and Gilletta, and when they are united, I will transform the king and queen into rabbits and their children into terriers. If a spark of pity for Septimus yet remains in me, I make no promise that he will escape the consequences of my vengeance. Hasten, however, to prepare all for the execution of my plan, and let us remember, dear Barbarek, that having abandoned the laws of the Paris for those of the Dives, we are enemies of fairies and of mankind, and must spare no effort to overwhelm them all with the weight of our hatred. The fairy of the field shuddered at this discourse. Motionless for a time, she quickly recalled her senses, realizing the danger of remaining any longer in such a terrible abode. She hastened to invoke the powerful assistance of the Queen of the Fairies. No sooner had she left the island than the sky darkened, the earth trembled, and dreadful groanings, accompanied by thunder and lightning, seemed to herald the universe's imminent destruction. Soon the air calmed, yet a new terror unfolded. The 24 dragons guarding the island's approaches, howling frightfully, lashed at one another with streams of fire, their combat culminating in their complete annihilation. When day returned, the torrent and island had vanished, leaving only a dry, arid rock. From its summit soared a black ostrich, bearing Prince Septimus and Gangan's little niece. Though these prodigies astonished her, the fairy of the fields, moved by concern for the children and guided by her kindness, pursued them with such swiftness that she soon overtook the ostrich. Her first impulse was to seize the prince and princess, yet seeing that the bird flew toward the fortunate island, she contented herself with following at a short distance. In due time, the ostrich alighted upon the fortunate island and approached the Queen of the Fairies herself. The sovereign sat upon a golden throne, adorned with jewels, surrounded by 12 fairies and genii, and a numerous royal fairy court. As the ostrich drew near, the fairy of the fields quickly took the prince and princess, placing them safely at the queen's feet. The malevolent Gangan, restored to her true form and character, now displayed confusion, malice, and despair in rapid succession, uncertain of what fate awaited her. The fairy queen spoke, her voice calm yet authoritative. The malignity of your mind and the perversity of your heart have, I see, prevented you from making good use of the power I bestowed upon you. Far from correcting your first faults by the gift of grand fairyism, granted to you by law and my kindness, you have abused it. Such abuse demands justice. You shall lose all power as a fairy for 2 years, and during that period, assume the form of a stork. You shall serve as a slave to my humblest Jinni. With these words, the queen touched Gangan with her scepter. All the fairies raised their wands in approbation and pronounced the necessary words of transformation. Instantly, the unfortunate Gangan became a stork and flew off to join the other birds of her species. The queen fairy then summoned the fairy Judicious Wisdom and entrusted the young prince and princess to her care during their stay at the court, particularly emphasizing the importance of cultivating their minds and forming their hearts. She embraced Septimus and Feliciana, the princess's name, and the amiable children, filled with joy and gratitude, reluctantly left her arms for those of their guardian, Judicious, also known as Wisdom. Under Judicious's careful guidance, They profited immensely from their education during the 2 years they resided with the Queen of the Fairies, earning the love and admiration of all at court. When Septimus reached 20 and Feliciana 19, the queen resolved to unite them in marriage and restore them, along with Septimus's brothers and sisters, to King Petard and Queen Gilletta. At the same time, she informed the Fairy of the Fields that, as an example to Septimus and Feliciana, the rebellious children, though now fully reformed, would only resume their proper shapes in the presence of the newly married couple upon their arrival at the palace. Having determined the time of their departure, the Fairy Queen entrusted to the Fairy of the Fields the 6 royal children she had carefully nurtured, instructing her to select suitable husbands and wives for them. She then summoned Judicious, charging her to accompany Prince Septimus and Princess Feliciana. The children wept at leaving the queen to whom they owed all their happiness, and the generous sovereign, embracing them tenderly, promised her enduring friendship and watched them depart with profound sorrow. They made no delay in proceeding to Petard's court, where the king had been in considerable embarrassment for several days. His mother, the late queen, having languished for many years, had at last vacated the throne. Deputies had been dispatched from her kingdom to invite Petard to accept the crown. They had already requested an audience, leaving Petard puzzled over the proper manner of receiving them, whether standing or seated, on horseback or on foot. To debate this point, the council assembled, each member proclaiming his own opinion. Carbuncle insisted that the king ought to stand, citing that emperors and their council were always standing except to eat or sleep. The Solicitor General countered that the king should be seated, asserting that kings and judges ought to be at ease and that nothing except a bed was as convenient as an armchair. The Chamberlain, however, argued for the king appearing on horseback, claiming it was the noblest posture, as kings were always represented thus in statues. Each counselor maintained his position, shouting and quarreling with one another. King Petard, finally raising his voice above the commotion, exclaimed, "Do you intend to leave off? There is surely enough noise over a chair, more or less, as I shall meet them, so they shall see me, and as they find me, so they must take me. That is all I know of the matter. As to becoming their king, many thanks to them. I should go mad with all the cares of royalty they say I must bear. Long live my own kingdom. Since I am content with that, I will hold fast to it, and they must accommodate themselves as best they can. But since they wish an audience they shall have. So let them be summoned." The councillors retired, murmuring discontentedly that the king had ignored their advice, blaming him for acting solely according to his own judgment. While they went to fetch the deputies, King Petard, confident in his own wisdom, dressed in his royal attire, and seated himself at the foot of his bed, whose curtains were arranged in festoons around the posts. In one hand he held his scepter, in the other his crown and fringed gloves. The queen sat at his right on a chair covered with blue silk and ornamented with large golden nails, her women standing behind her. To the king's left were his high officers, nearly all stifling laughter at the singular figure of their monarch. When all was arranged, the doors were opened and the deputies entered, followed by all the important people of King Petard's mighty state. They made 3 deep salams to the king and queen, who acknowledged them with 3 equally profound bows. Just as the deputies were about to commence their harangue, a woman of majestic bearing entered, leading a young man of about 20 years. Addressing Queen Gilletta, she spoke, "Queen, all comes in time to him who can wait. Your misfortunes are over, and your destiny has changed course. Behold the Prince Septimus, your son, whom a superior power has protected from the fairy Gangan's wickedness. The perfidious and treacherous fairy can no longer harm him. Her malice has been confounded. Receive at last your dear son, Septimus, and you, deputies, render homage to the lawful successor to the throne of your kingdom." The king, recognizing his son, swept him into his arms and kissed him 1,000 times. Then, in his joy, he embraced the Fairy of the Fields herself, disregarding her age or station, and did the same with Carbuncle, the Solicitor General, the Chamberlain, and all present. Removing his royal mantle, he placed it upon Septimus, gave him his scepter, seated him at the foot of the bed, and began to shout at the top of his voice, "Long live the king!" The nobles echoed him immediately, and the people followed, to whom the king kept shouting, "Shout away, you there, shout away!" Meanwhile, the queen, overcome with joy and gratitude, had fallen at the fairy's feet, embracing her and weeping. The fairy gently raised her and signaled her desire to speak. All grew silent, except for the king, whose joy left him oblivious to all else. Finally, finding himself out of breath, he quieted, and the fairy spoke. "What you see," she said, "is only a portion of the favors your friend, the Fairy of the Fields, bestows upon you. She gives you, with the prince, a young and amiable princess whom the queen of the fairies has destined to be your son's wife. If her mind and beauty are slight guarantees for the happiness of this favored couple, the mildness of her character and goodness of her heart, which I have nurtured, shall ensure its duration. Confirm this happy union, and thus deserve the powerful protection of the Fairy of the Fields." The king would hear no more. Taking the hands of Prince Septimus and Princess Feliciana, he cried, "Done! I marry them with all my heart and give to them all my kingdoms and revenues. As to my other children, I shall trouble myself no more. Our friend, this good lady of the fields, will see that they want for nothing. Now let us have the wedding and rejoice. You shall all dine with me, and as my wife says, all comes in time to him who can wait. Now, father-in-law," he continued, turning to Carbuncle, "go to the kitchen, have all killed that is in my poultry yard, and above all, let us have good cheer, for I would have this affair well spoken of." The governor obeyed, but as he crossed the dining-room hall, he beheld a table laid with 24 dishes of the finest meats. Astonished, he quickly returned to report to the king and queen. Eager to witness this fairy festival, everyone went at once to the dining-room hall with some trepidation and little ceremony. At first hesitant to taste the food, they soon gained courage, and the king, to whom it cost nothing, set the example, eating heartily and drinking generously. Though he repeated his old stories and good words often in the same terms, laughter followed every time. After about 2 hours at table, violins were heard in the audience chamber. Having eaten and drunk their fill, all rose willingly, in high spirits. The king wished for a dance, insisting on opening the ball with the young queen, calling for his favorite dance. The violins struck up and he began, but after repeatedly putting everyone out 20 times and declaring they did not know the dance, he gave up in despair. He then asked the young prince and princess to dance a minuet, which they performed with admirable grace. As they completed the final obeisance, 6 puppets entered, finely dressed, 3 hero warriors and 3 maiden ladies. Each displayed the visible tip of a nose, and the spectacle conducted by a lady drew all eyes. The puppets performed a ballet in which the 6 tips of the noses figured admirably. The ballet concluded, and they arranged themselves in a ring following their original order. The conductress touched the 6 tips of the noses with her wand, and in their place appeared 3 puppets and 3 dancing dolls. very good," said the king. "All that will do for my grandchildren. I will spare no expense to keep and clothe them. I shall take care of them with pleasure until the grandchildren come." "Not so fast, sire," replied the lady. "Have patience. All comes in time to him who can wait." Immediately the 12 puppets danced again, astonishing the spectators as they gradually changed faces and dresses. "Mercy on us!" cried the king. "Why, there are 3 sons, my dear, and our 3 daughters, love. No, I cannot believe it. Oh, by my scepter, this is admirable." Turning to the conductress, he exclaimed, "Hold! I will bet my crown and royal mantle that you are our friend, the Lady of the Fields. Faith, you are worth your weight in gold. Here are our children, all finely dressed, as big as their father and mother, but how are we to get them married?" "I will manage that," replied the Fairy of the Fields, for it was indeed herself, "and it shall be done immediately." Beside himself with joy, the king took her hand, lavished compliments, and seated her near Gilletta. "This is the Lady of the Fields, our very good friend," he cried. The queen, overcome by gratitude and tenderness for her children, gave herself up entirely to her emotions. The fairy then introduced the unknown princes and princesses she had brought, proposing them in marriage to Gilletta's 6 children. The king and queen consented immediately. All applauded the fairy's choice, and the deputies proclaimed Septimus and Feliciana king and queen. The 7 marriages were celebrated in a manner worthy of the wisdom of judicious and the noble simplicity of the Fairy of the Fields. Septimus granted each of his brothers and brothers-in-law governance over the largest and most prosperous provinces of his kingdom. The 7 princes departed with their wives, accompanied by fairies who only left them upon their arrival at their respective capitals. There, the fairies instructed them in the governance of their families and provinces, lavishing kindness and generosity before returning to their own duties. As for Petard and Gilletta, the good fortune of their children brought them neither ambition nor jealousy, nor did it alter their humble way of thinking. The pomp and majesty expected of a grand queen did not suit Gilletta's natural simplicity, while Petard's character and genius were ill matched to the cares of a large kingdom. Yet they were content. Petard would not have exchanged his governor, his games at piquet, or his royal kitchen garden for all the grandeur in the world, and Gilletta would not have traded her spinning wheel, her dairy, or the treasured friendship of the Fairy of the Fields for any amount of worldly magnificence. In their humble contentment, they lived quietly and happily, watching their children flourish under the protection and guidance of the fairies, grateful for the blessings that had been so wondrously bestowed upon their family and kingdom.